Thank you, Chris. It's a joy to be here with all of you. To all the organizations that have put this event together and made it possible for me to be here, I'd like to say thank you. And to the wonderful world of the seed, I'd like to say thank you. Because, you know, I started out life thinking the quanta was going to be my companion for life. And I had to abandon that passionate love affair with physics and quantum physics in particular for a love affair with the seed. Partly because the threat to the seed made me realize how vital it was to continuity of life. The word for seed in Hindi and Sanskrit is bija. Ja means life, and bija means that in which life resides to arise on its own again and again and again. And when we start a season, lots of seed festivals with every cultivation season, and we do, because of our tropical climate, have many more cultivation seasons. Some places we have 4 seasons of cultivation, especially in the area of, for example, of Bengal and Orissa. In some places we have 3, but most places we have 2. And before you sow the seed, there's a prayer. Let the seed be exhaustless. Let life never run out. And there's stories from around the world, stories from my region. I come from the Himalayan belt, where during a war and a famine, people died of starvation. But the seed which used to be kept in empty squash containers, which we call the tomri, not one seed had been eaten. Because every culture recognized you cannot eat seed corn. You've got to save it for the future. Your life doesn't matter, but life in general does matter. And it's that wisdom of the seed to renew, to multiply, to be shared, to be spread, that has suddenly been seen as a problem for those who would make money out of killing the seed, killing the essential nature of the seed as a reproductive, renewable resource. And every attempt has been made in the last 2 decades to turn seed into a non-renewable resource. Out of which, something that in its own nature creates abundance. You know, every tiny seed, I get fascinated with seeds of amaranth, for example. You know how tiny that little seed of amaranth is? And at least in our Himalaya, you can't even begin to count the number of seeds one seed of amaranth can give rise to. Or the millets, or even the rices and the wheats and the barleys. One gives rise to many. That's a problem. One should give rise to nothing. Then you make the profits. And during the 80s, I was very involved in some of these discussions. There used to be in the FAO at that time, the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations, a term used called seed wars. The chemical industry that had moved into the seed sector had started to say it's not fair that farmers save seed. It's not equitable that they save seed. Equity is monopoly. Only the corporations should have the right to seed. And they spent a lot of time, couldn't get their way, because in the United Nations, you have one vote for one country. And the majority of the countries happen to be third world countries. They happen to be countries which have given seed and biodiversity to the world. and they did not like the idea of seed being reduced to private property. So the corporations then moved to a new institution that was being created through what was then a half institution called the General Agreement on Trade and Tariffs. And it's fascinating that for 30 years, the industry had drafted laws for all kinds of monopoly. Monopoly in entertainment. If a Mickey Mouse turns up anywhere, even in a child's notebook, they should pay royalty, or a t-shirt. And then, by then, a company that had only been related to warfare, to Agent Orange, very rapidly moved into the biotechnology sector, very rapidly started to buy up both venture capital firms as well as seed companies. And Monsanto emerged as the biggest seed monopoly in the world in the drafting of what is today called the Trade-Related Intellectual Property Rights Agreement. What a mouthful. Precisely because this is not trade-related and seed is not intellectual property. It doesn't pop out of anyone's head. Intellectual property is defined as property in products of the mind. Here is a very material, biological system that is suddenly redefined as intellectual property. And a whole agreement was shaped around it, and TR was put because India, my country, refused to accept patent law as a trade issue. They said, no, this is about nations deciding how far monopolies will go, nations deciding the balance between the public and the private. And we had worked out a patent law over 20 years of democratic debate in society to get rid of the British laws that had been exactly like what we are coming back to. Total monopoly in the handful, in a few companies' hands. So the lawyers, of course, were very clever, put TR before IP and said, now it's trade-related by definition, so now you will accept it. After the WTO came into force, a representative of Monsanto actually said this. He said, what we've achieved in this agreement is something unprecedented. We defined a problem. And in this case, the problem was farmers saving seeds. That was a problem. And we defined the solution, make it illegal for farmers to save seeds. And we created the instrument, which is the TRIPS agreement, which forces every country now to have laws of monopoly. And we created the institution that would ensure that these are implemented. The institution, WTO, is an interesting institution because it's the international court. It's an international non-parliament, non-democratic. And it is the international executive. Yeah? As Monsanto's representative said, in shaping this treaty, we were the patient, the diagnostician, and the physician all in one. For me, that's a description of dictatorship. If you define the problem, you find the solution, you become the judge and the executive, where is democracy? And around seed, which is the most democratic experience on the planet, that spreads abundance. The seed is as much part of the relationship with the bee and the butterfly as it is with the soil organisms that it ultimately sustains, as it is with the food, the breakfast you're eating. All these relationships are in the seed. In 1992 was, I think, the first time US companies started to enter India. 91 was when the whole new idea of globalization started to be spread, initially through the World Bank, and 95 onwards through the World Trade Organization. And I remember in 92, Cargill, which still owned its own seed supply, now it's owned by Monsanto. I don't know how many of you realize that outside the US, Cargill Seeds is now Monsanto. That time Cargill was still Cargill. And they brought in hybrid sunflower seeds, which failed miserably. I've been working with the farmers in India and the farmers' organizations, and I had been telling them about these corporations. At that time, of course, Cargill was, and still is, the biggest grain trader. And while doing workshops on the Uruguay round and the WTO and the GATT, I should tell them about the companies. The farmers of Karnataka, as a result of the failure of the sunflower, marched up to the Cargill. It shouldn't be called a seed production unit, because seeds are produced in the field and in farms, and the seed utilities and facilities are really only packaging units. All they do is put a seal on it. And again, you might not even remember, you used to have a trade representative whose name was Carla Hills. And Carla Hills had visited India in 1988, saying, crowbar by crowbar, we are going to open your economy to our companies. And this was around the time, we'd had Bhopal in '84. DuPont was sending an old nylon plant, and we were saying, sorry, we don't want it. And Carla Hill said, no, you'll have it. Your market is our market. And she talked about this crowbar by crowbar, and I talked to my farmer friends about it. So they went, literally, with crowbars, and pulled down this whole large prison-like utility, and raised it to the ground and said, crowbar by crowbar, we're going to send these companies back to you. That's only part of the story. The real story is at the end of it. The Cargill head for Asia Pacific flies into India, holds a press conference, and says how stupid Indian farmers are, because they don't realize Cargill, with its intelligence, is creating seeds which prevent the bees from usurping the pollen. This wonderful act of creating fertility through pollination is now redefined as theft in a mindset where life should be owned as a monopoly. No plant should grow without permission of the companies. No seed should renew without permission of the company. And of course, no farmer should ever regrow a crop without paying a royalty. In the negotiations on the Convention on Biological Diversity, a twin statement was made about Roundup resistance. We were basically saying we don't need negative traits like making crops more resistant and tolerant to herbicides. We need to phase out herbicides rather than spray more of them. And if pesticides were bad, we definitely don't need pesticide plants. Plants which produce their own pesticide by introducing genes for toxins into it, like the Bt crops. And in the case of Roundup, again, I remember in the negotiations on the Convention on Biological Diversity, the Monsanto representative, I think it was the vice president or chair, and he says, we are now breeding crops that prevent weeds from stealing the sunshine. Now, what is called weeds is really the biodiversity of diverse fields. And the best sustainable agriculture, the best organic farming, has to be rotational and mixtures. I don't think the minute you have a monoculture, I disqualify it as organic. Because organic means letting nature do the essential work of renewal, of soil fertility, moisture conservation. And if we have to let nature do the work, nature needs companions. It needs partners. It needs helpers. And only diversity offers the help and the substitutes for the poisons that have entered farming. Only nature. The nitrogen fixing that nature can do if we do the right mixing. The wonderful botanicals that are available for pest control. I fought for 11 years a case on the piracy of our wonderful tree that we have used for pest control for as long as I remember. I remember when I first saw the patent on neem, and it was said this is an invention of the pesticide use. And I said, my mother and grandmother were using neem to store grain, to store clothes. Farmers of India have constantly used neem. And when the terrible disaster of Bhopal took place in '84, I remember I went to Bhopal, and the coolies at the station were laughing at me because I was carrying these saplings of neem. And they said, "Why are you carrying this?" And I told them about the disaster and said, "We are starting a campaign, no more Bhopals, plant a neem." And then 10 years later, find neem has been patented. Before that, 11 years. And this is just one of thousands, and every part of the world has its own way of controlling weeds, of controlling pests, of doing everything that toxic chemicals have been introduced into farming for. I think the big problem with how seed has moved from being the ultimate source of renewal of life to becoming the ultimate non-renewable resource patented and owned by a handful of companies. Now it's reduced to 5, very rapidly reduced to 5 in this decade. So fast that you can't even count. You can't even keep up with the counting. Partly because for us this has all happened in a very short period. For you it happened over 100 years. And so the generations that have passed who saw the first disappearance of the open seed, the free seed. We started to see the problem with the Green Revolution introduced in 1965-66 in India. And the Green Revolution was basically the introduction of chemical industrial farming in a peasant economy, where the average land holdings are less than a hectare. 80% land holdings are less than a hectare. 70% of India, of a 1.2 billion population, lives on the land. Yeah. So you can imagine how tiny our farms are. And on this land was introduced the chemicals. Why did the Green Revolution have to wait till 1965-66? They were trying from the end of the war. All those war chemicals, including the nitrogen from explosives factories, all the pesticides, they needed to find a market. But the indigenous seeds practice non-cooperation with chemicals. They just lodge. No, don't want you. So the problem was the seed had to be redesigned to adapt to chemicals. The promotion, propaganda by the Green Revolution was feeding the hungry. No, it was just spreading chemicals and poisons around the world. And the redesigning was done by the dwarfing technique, taking genes from the dwarf varieties, in the case of rice, from Indonesian variety, in the case of wheat, from a Japanese variety collected during the war, Norin. And these dwarf varieties then could take a lot of chemicals, but they required a lot of water. Interestingly, the dwarfing was making the plant produce less biological matter. And the useful biological matter for the soil, for the animals, had just disappeared overnight. The straw was now seen as waste. But the straw is what feeds the cattle. The straw is what goes back into your compost. The straw is what makes organic. So this one change to adapt the seed to chemical meant the disappearance of fodder for livestock, therefore the disappearance of animals, therefore the entry of tractors into a poor country. And I go around the country and find some of the highest debt is for the tractors that were bought 20 years, 30 years ago. Today, the farmers are having to pay the bills and they can't afford to. And the cattle have disappeared. Because truly sustainable agriculture is agriculture not just with diversity of crops, but with an integration with livestock and an integration with perennials and trees. Then you have the perfect organic farm. Then nature has a way to recycle the biological systems to perfection. And as Howard said, writing about Indian farms in 1905 when he came to India, And in his wonderful book, The Agricultural Testament, Howard said, the farms here are as permanent as the forest and the prairie, because they work on those principles of nature. And that's another reason why I feel there has to be a much more intimate interaction between the ecology movement and the organic movement, because some ecologists still think that the day farming began, nature was assaulted. No, you can work with nature in non-violent ways to produce for human needs while keeping space, leaving adequate ecological space for other species. And even more importantly, a lesson we have learned: the more space you leave for other beings, the more food you get for human beings. Totally counterintuitive in the modern life. Of course, the more has to be counted in diversity. And I have talked about the monoculture of the mind, which excludes diversity, focuses on a single commodity and on the yield of one part of a plant for that commodity production, shrinks the farm's biological capacity, and talks about increasing production. And that's because the monoculture of the mind has left the biodiversity out. I really think we need to shift from measuring yields to measuring output. And we need to, yields refer to an individual commodity production, and yields refer to what leaves the farm. Output refers to what the farm produces, including what will be used as an internal input on the farm itself. Something that's just not calculated. All the compost we grow, the seeds we grow out, they're never counted as part of what the farm is producing. Well, this Green Revolution was wearing out and yields were coming down in Punjab, and as my book, The Violence of the Green Revolution, shown, 50% of the land is diseased, 10% is dead. The soils are dead. Waterlogged, saline. And Punjab was picked for the Green Revolution because it was the most prosperous and fertile area. It's a land of the 5 rivers. That's what Punjab means. Punj is 5, Ab is waters. No lack of water, Indo-Gangetic plain, most fertile soils. And what hadn't been destroyed over 5,000 years of farming was destroyed within 10 years of chemical agriculture. And there seems to be a habit of, if things go wrong and things are unsustainable, just do more of it faster. And that's what biotech has become. It's called, in India, it's called the second Green Revolution. And interestingly, when your former President Bush signed an agreement with our Prime Minister in 2005 on the nuclear deal, there was another piece of paper right there on the desk, which is an agriculture agreement, to make genetic engineering central. And on the board of this agreement sit Monsanto, sit Walmart, and I think ConAgra. So our relationship now is very, very intimate, because it's the same companies that are preventing American farmers from having access to seed, and are preventing Indian farmers from not just having access to seed, but having access to life. The first GM crop introduced into India was in '98, and it's the BT cotton. I just call it the pesticide cotton. The BT cotton was brought in by Monsanto, and Monsanto put these arrogant ads in the newspapers about how Indian farmers would have Bolgard. So I started to ring up the ministries and said, have they sought approval? And of course, nobody had been checked, because Monsanto had worked on dismantling laws in this country, so there's no regulation on genetic engineering in the US at all. It's a deregulated sector. And Monsanto thought you can walk into any country and assume there is no regulation, but we do have regulation. And so I took them to court, I sued them, took them to the Supreme Court, and the introduction was delayed up to 2005. Since 2005, they've started to sell BT cotton, and in certain areas, there's only BT cotton available now. These are the areas where the farmers where we have the highest rate of farmer suicides. In the last decade, during which seed monopolies were established, during which the global players started to buy up Indian companies or have licensing arrangements with them, we have lost more than 200,000 farmers in suicide. We've of course lost 8 million farmers who've had to leave the land. And it's a combination of seed monopolies and falling prices linked to the subsidies, the $4 billion in the case of cotton, and the unfair trade rules. It is a genocidal packet that must destroy farmers, and doesn't kill farmers metaphorically, it kills farmers biologically. We started 2 years ago to work in this area. And the interesting thing is, by shifting to organic, the farmers are earning 10 times more than the BT cotton farmers, even though every advertisement of Monsanto talks about how farmers earn more with GM crops. And that's also very interesting. You know, my mind kind of gets very troubled every time I see a huge inconsistency. So why should you have seed monopolies for cheap food? Costly seed, cheap food. Something must be going funny in the middle. You get farmers to pay higher royalties and they're supposed to have higher incomes. How? The aim of the seed industry is $1 trillion of profits from royalties every year. And the aim is no farmer should have access to their own seed. The aim is every farmer should be forced into the market every year. And you can only do that by using multiple instruments of control over the seed. The first instrument, as I mentioned, is the intellectual property laws, covering both patents as well as breeders' rights that have become more and more like patents. Earlier, you used to have farmers' concessions, you used to have breeders' concessions. They've all gone in the new UPOV. The UPOV 1991 looks just like a patent law. And interestingly, a patent is supposed to be granted for an invention. A seed is not an invention. A seed exists before you can do anything with it. All you can do with the seed is manipulate it. Manipulation has never been treated as creation. It's often treated as cruelty. I would call GM cruelty to seed. And yet, there has been this claim to invention and therefore a right to ownership. Of course, it's very interesting because it reflects a fundamental split, a fundamental schizophrenia. When it comes to owning seeds and owning plants through patents, the same corporations go around and saying, we've created something new, it's novel. The word used in the European laws is novel foods. GM foods is not called GM foods, it's called novel foods. And when it comes to people being concerned about the environmental risks, the health risks, the same industry comes around and says, just like nature made it. You're doing nothing new. This is like the bacteria in your yogurt and that's why they picked the word biotechnology and shed the word genetic engineering. Because biotechnology was grandmother making cheese and yogurt. And Syngenta and Monsanto were doing exactly what your grandmother did, nothing new. Except grandmother never took a patent, and you are taking a patent. Now, the legal term that has been created in the US and has been spread around the world, a highly unscientific term, that's used to make GM look natural, is substantial equivalence. Treat the genetically engineered seed as equal to the parent. So don't look, don't see, don't find, declare safety. And anytime a scientist comes up with looking at what has happened, you make sure you hound that scientist out of their lab and their work. Especially with the new intimate relationship between universities and the companies, it's not that difficult. Over the last 20 years, I've seen some of the top scientists with whom I worked being forced out of their university system just because they did an independent piece of research. Arpad Putzai, Mewan Ho, Ignacio Chapela, they tried with the Berkeley scientists, couldn't work it out because he just did a satyagraha. He brought his chair in front of the dean's office and said, I won't move till you give me my tenure. And they were forced. Eileen Ingham from the University of Oregon did this amazing work on the impact of GM wheat with the soil bacterium, genes from a soil bacterium added to it. And that led, in fact, to the company, the German company, withdrawing that product, but it also led to the International Biosafety Protocol. She is now an independent scientist, but does not have a lab in the university. So every time independent science is done, it's defined as junk science, and junk science is institutionalized as real science, as good science. And these days, you know, the good, bad thing, good bank, bad bank, after they've created all this toxic assets. Yeah? Suddenly there's supposed to be a bad bank that will take up all this corruption of the financial world. And again, interesting concept. Yeah? Concentrate toxicity and it'll become neutralized. The work we've been doing on suicides of farmers has started to have government response. In the early days, the government used to say, oh, they must have been alcoholics, so they must have committed adultery. And I said, that's a large number of farmers suddenly becoming adulterers and alcoholics. And eventually, the Prime Minister had to go down to these areas and recognize that farmers' suicides linked to economic distress is a real phenomenon. So what does Monsanto do? Start using institutions to say there's no link between suicides and the Bt cotton. But the interesting thing is the papers they generate, as one from IFPRI, which has been used a lot against me, in the International Food Policy Research Institute in Washington has put out a paper. It goes round about the virtues of Bt as if everything is built into the seed. And then when it comes to the failure or it comes to the farmers going into distress, then it is no more about the seed itself, it's about the farmer who was stupid, it's about the soil that was wrong, and it was about the climate that didn't fit. And here again you have schizophrenia. Good performance in the GM seed, bad performance, you're to blame. So always there's a perpetuation of a mythology of the perfect seed. And interestingly, the Green Revolution, when it was spread to India, they didn't just say, we are bringing you seeds that are more responsive to chemicals, which would have been the more honest way to describe it, rather than high-yielding varieties. This Borlaug, who was a scientist who did that dwarfing, interestingly, he came out of the DuPont Defense Labs, knew about the chemicals, reworked the plants to be able to take more chemicals, just as genetic engineering is reworking the plants once more at a deeper genetic level to be even more adaptive to chemicals. Borlaug said of the 12 scientists he had trained, he called them his apostles. They were his wheat apostles, distributing miracle seeds. Yeah. So you do have a whole structure of seed monopolies enshrined within a new mythology, a new religion, where we are asked to be blind and not think anymore. Interestingly, in the case of Indian sales, Monsanto actually recruits our gods as salesmen. Every poster, every video has a god. In northern state of Punjab, where the Sikhs are the most important religion, and Guru Nanak was the founder of that religion, Guru Nanak is used as a salesman. In South India, out of the Ramayana, you get Hanuman, who brought this herb to save the life of Ram's brother. You have Hanuman bringing you this life-saving seed, which is really the killing seed. That's another way in which seed monopolies are established. Seed monopolies are also established by introducing seed replacement. And whenever I debate with our government, I always tell them, I say, you know, seeds are not like dirty socks. Yeah? When your socks start to stink, you'd better change them and wash them. But seeds are perennial. They don't get replaced. You evolve them, you breed them, you adapt them, but you don't throw them out. They're not like a new model of a car either. Seeds are life itself, and therefore seed replacement is wrong. Now, you can only have a monopoly on seed through patent if you have had a closure on the alternative supply. Because why on earth would farmers pay royalties every year if they could have free seed they can save year in and year out? To create that closure, the industry has evolved compulsory licensing and registration laws. Compulsory registration, compulsory licensing laws. Which basically mean farmers can't have their own seed, they must only grow seeds that are licensed. They must have approval from the state. But an indigenous seed evolved and bred by farmers, an open pollinated variety seed, has never done harm to anyone. GM seeds can cause genetic contamination. But an open pollinated variety has no harm. And since it has no harm, there is absolutely no need for state regulation. The state regulates the harmful. It should not invade into the harmless zones of life. The interesting thing is, they tried to introduce this law in 2004 in India. It's called the New Seed Law. It's not that we don't have a seed law. We have a seed law. But it doesn't prevent farmers from having their own seed. It merely regulated the industry. Now they want to have farmers regulated and the seed industry, now the biotech industry, deregulated. So we did what Gandhi had done in 1930. You might remember the British had tried to monopolize salt, just so they could buy bigger guns to control us better. And the salt laws were meant to make salt making illegal by Indians. Only the British could make the salt. And Gandhi walked to the beach and picked up the salt and said, nature gives this for free. We need it for our survival. We will continue to make salt. We are forced to disobey your laws. And the salt laws never worked in India. People went to jail, people were killed, but the salt laws never worked in India. So we took inspiration from that and have been doing what we call the seed satyagraha. The satyagraha means the fight for truth. Beginning 91, when these monopolies were created, we've had rally after rally, 500,000 farmers, 2 million farmers, basically declaring that seed is a common resource. We have received it from our ancestors. We have to protect it for future generations of all species. Because seed doesn't just belong to humans. It belongs to all the species who are nourished by any species of a plant. We will therefore not obey a law that makes it illegal for us to perform our highest ecological duty on earth, which is to save seeds for the future. So in 2004, we stopped this law from coming into force. I gave more, I don't know how many millions of signatures I gave to our Prime Minister, and said, you can do what the British did with the salt law. We are not going to obey because we have to obey higher law. Monsanto law is a low law, degraded law, and any law restricting farmers' rights is, in today's world, a Monsanto law. Even when governments write it, an invisible hand of Monsanto is behind that writing. So how do we create seed freedom in this time of seed imperialism, seed colonialism, seed closure? We do it by creating community seed banks. That's how I started Navdanya 21 years ago, just saving every seed available and distributing it widely, keeping it as an open access system. Every farmer of Navdanya, and we have about 400,000 members, every farmer, the only thing they have to do is take a pledge that seed will never be used as an exclusive right. Not by them, not by anyone else. They will continue to share seed and they will continue to save seed. In the area of the suicides, we have managed to save seeds and bring farmers organic options back. We've also just finished some research to show the BT cotton has destroyed in 3 years of planting 26% of vital microorganisms in the soil. So organic is the only way to rebuild it. We have created climate resilient seed banks. Banks where seeds for high drought tolerance, high flood tolerance, salt tolerant seeds are available. And we've distributed these every time there's a disaster, a drought in central India, or even after the tsunami, the salt tolerant rices. We took 2 truckloads of these seeds. Interestingly, Monsanto, which has been a leader in biopiracy and Syngenta and the biotech industry, is now trying to patent the climate resilient traits, which they can't create because genetic engineering is a very linear single gene expression technology. Climate resilience is a multi-genetic trait, but all they're doing is genetic mapping, and these days computers do it. You don't even need a human being. In fact, if there's a property right they want to give, they should give it to that machine. Because they're not doing the thinking, they're not doing the creation. It's an assembly line of doing a genome mapping. The map is being used to claim ownership, and we are going to start a big campaign to not just keep seeds in the open domain, but especially seeds required for climate adaptation as a common resource for our common defense in these vulnerable times. We will, of course, have to make very rapid and radical shifts very fast from breeding for responding to chemicals to breeding for resilience, adaptation. From breeding for a single yield trait to breeding for nutrition and taste and quality. We've done a lot of research with native varieties. They always have higher nutritional quality. So we should be measuring nutrition per crop and nutrition per acre, not just the mass produced. What's the point of empty mass? Empty mass doesn't nourish our bodies. Empty mass doesn't nourish the soil. We need to go back seriously to the issue of quality, the issue of nutrition, the issue of life itself. Saving seed, for me, is defending life. And saving seeds in these vulnerable times is making sure we can imagine with hope that life will continue in all its vibrance, in all its diversity, in all its beauty. Thank you.
You've been listening to physicist, ecologist, and author Vandana Shiva, speaking at the Organicology Conference in Portland, Oregon on February 28, 2009. In a moment, we'll return to the question and answer session from the presentation. Vandana Shiva, a physicist, feminist, philosopher of science, and science policy advocate, is the director of the Research Foundation for Science, Technology, and Natural Resource Policy. She is the 1993 recipient of the Right Livelihood Award and serves as ecology advisor to several organizations, including the Third World Network and the Asia-Pacific People's Environment Network. Her books include Staying Alive, Women, Ecology, and Development, The Violence of the Green Revolution, Third World Agriculture, Ecology, and Politics, Biopiracy, The Plunder of Nature and Knowledge, Soil Not Oil, Environmental Justice in an Age of Climate Crisis, Stolen Harvest, The Hijacking of the Global Food Supply, and Water Wars, Privatization, Pollution, and Profit. Her latest book is Earth Democracy, Justice, Sustainability, and Peace. To find out more about Vandana Shiva and her work, please visit the Navdanya website at www.navdanya.org. And now we return to the question and answer session from the program.
Good morning. I just had a question that relates to the speaker that we had yesterday, Paul Roberts. And he mentioned, someone asked a question about local food and the possibilities of us around the world being able to raise our own food, enough food for ourselves where we live right now with climate change and our expectations of what we should be able to eat, seasonality and that kind of thing. And in response to this, one of the things that he said was that in many of the Asian countries, that at the rate of population growth, they will not be able to sustain themselves using sustainable agricultural practices and be able to feed themselves. And one thing that we can do here in the United States and North America is to be able to, using sustainable practices, grow enough food so that we will be able to ship food to Asian countries, preventing starvation. And I was just wondering if you could address this idea of local food and with population raising all the time, being able to feed, everyone being able to feed themselves where they are for themselves.
Well, the first thing about local food is that the tropics lend themselves better to producing more food. And for anyone who thinks a temperate climate and cultivation in deserts based on mining aquifers has to be the basis of providing food to the world. And Asian countries, most of which are tropical countries, a little bit of China is outside the tropics. But I mean, you go from India into Indonesia and Malaysia, should see the abundance. We have a report, you can get this from our website, navdanya.org, Navdanya, and it's on biodiversity-based productivity. And we've done survey after survey of hundreds of farms, including our organic farms. The food production is double, sometimes fivefold more. The reason it's not seen is because the agricultural paradigm has been reduced to a monoculture of commodities. Then you focus on the commodities and say they can't produce more commodities, but we can produce more food. And local food with its diversity means you have far more access to the diversity of plants which have been food sources which we've forgotten about. Humans ate 8,500 species of plants. Today, 8 crops account for all the commodities, and 4 crops account for all the GM crops planted. Most of this is not going to feed people. Majority of it is going to feed cattle in factory farms or drive cars through the biofuel change. So more commodity production does not mean more food for people. It in fact means less food for people. I actually feel if we did the right kind of agriculture, India would be feeding America. And we did, after all. Why did Columbus come to this land? Because he was looking for India, and that's why Native Americans are called Indians. And he was looking for an agricultural product, the spices. I think what we need to shift to, as I said, is diversity. The minute you have local diversity, you can increase food availability and nutritional availability hugely. Much of the diversity has been destroyed because centralized management of anything needs monocultures. And if one Cargill sitting in the US must manage trade around the world, it must reduce the varieties of crops, it must shrink the chicken breeds, it must shrink the hog breeds, it must just shrink, because then you can manage better. You cannot have inventories of 100,000 rice varieties as we used to grow in India. So you must shrink. I think the only option is local, because it's only with local you recycle enough locally for sustainable agriculture, and it's only with local you can actually manage the complexity and the caring that sustainability requires. Because what's gone deficit in agriculture is the element of caring. We've increased the capital expenditure and diminished the element of care. Now Navdanya means 9 seeds. We also grow 12 crops together in a system called Baranaja, and we have these fields in our farm. And when visitors come, they say, but isn't it difficult to harvest? I said, this farm can't take one Caterpillar harvester. We have to do it by hand. And farming must increasingly become like gardening. When you have 100 plants growing in your garden, you don't say it's tough to harvest that one flower. You harvest it. And in the same way, we need to move out of having agriculture respond to machines and chemicals to having agriculture respond to the laws of nature and the human caring element. And there is no limit to where we can go. I can't show you from here in this big room, but there is a wonderful survey done by a scientist called Bayless Smith. That's industrial agriculture, and it plateaus off because the inputs keep poisoning the base of production. And ecological systems continue to evolve. We haven't even started testing our potential as human beings. Every time there's been a population growth, humans have innovated another way of farming to intensify biologically, not intensify chemically. There's also in this report all the FAO data that shows the smaller the farm, the higher the output. Because in the small farm, you can intensify biologically much better. So I don't think Asia is going to face the problem. With climate change, it's the two vulnerable zones which were made the breadbaskets of the world through industrial farming, Australia and the Midwest. These are going to be the problems with climate change. And that's why we need biodiversity, because diversity is an insurance under any changing context. And we need organic. As my new book, Soil Not Oil, shows, the only way we can farm in periods of climate change for mitigation and adaptation is organically.
My name is Lawrence Holmes, Crescent Community Farm in Loveland, Colorado. Out of the book, Small is Beautiful, from Schumacher, Economics as if People Mattered. The term human face he puts on an economy. And Gandhi said it's production, not mass production, but production of the masses. All justices come from a just economy. What's happened is the opposite. I think it's time to join hands. All thousands of organizations and peoples and that are on the earth, and not work at patchwork, but create an economy based on people, fertility and seeds of pureness, and a workplace for people. How do I do it?
Well, you've got all these amazing people to learn from, and I've also started a small school of the seed linked to the Schumacher College in England. On our farm, we do short courses. I'm going to leave some of these flyers. Everything's again available on the website Navdanya. And for any of you who'd like to just see the potential of biodiversity to solve the problem of hunger, to solve the problem of climate, and to bring back food freedom and seed freedom to farmers, we would welcome you anytime on our farm.
Thank you. Elizabeth.
Good morning. I teach at a community college. If you were 18, what would you decide to do right now?
Well, you know, when I was 18 in my real life, like I said, all I wanted to do was quantum physics. If I was 18 today, all I'd want to do is be an organic farmer.
We've seen an increase in diseases like obesity and heart disease in the U.S. because of our diet. How can we encourage, as retailers and as restaurateurs, how can we encourage a diverse traditional diet over the Western diet that we have currently, or that's been encouraged?
Yeah. Two quick things. You know, the diseases of obesity, diabetes, etc. are intimately linked to the other malnutrition, the denial of food to people. Most of the people who are hungry today are growers of food. But they're growing food on the basis of credit, on the basis of debt, on the basis of borrowing for costly chemicals and non-renewable seeds. In the process, they have to sell everything they grow in order to just pay back the debt and go hungry themselves. So the billion hungry and the 2 billion tending towards the obesity and other problems is part of the same problem. And it's all linked to the issue of seed. If we design seeds and breed seeds that need chemicals, we'll get farmers into debt, we'll create hungry people, but we will also create nutritionally empty food loaded with chemicals. If there's anything increasing in yield, it's the toxic yield of our food. Also, the more we empty food, the more industry tries to add nutrition from outside through chemical fortification. It's a big war going on, a nutritional war, where the hungriest people have become the latest market through an alliance called the Global Alliance for Improved Nutrition. It's all about industrial food being industrially fortified rather than ecological food having all the fortification ecologically provided from the soil. All nutrition deficits in food are coming from deficits in the soil. If you don't have iron, you don't have calcium, you don't have sodium, you don't have magnesium in your soil, you're not going to have it in your food. And the only way to get all these micronutrients and trace elements in the food is through the organic manuring and through seeds that are able to respond to an organic ecology and an organic context. So the way for retailers, the way for food businesses, the way for restaurants to bring nutritional improvement and quality improvement is really to nurture the seed supply of nutritious, diverse, tasty crops for an organic production. I think seeds, I'm not mad that I started to turn seed saving into my life's passion. In 1987, I realized if we don't save seeds, we can't have anything else. If we don't have the seeds for nutrition, we won't have nutrition. If we don't have the seeds for climate resilience, we won't have climate resilience. If you don't have the seeds for organic, you won't have organic. And if you don't have the seeds for freedom, you won't have freedom. And for me, freedom is the ability to save seed year in and year out, generation in and generation out. And there's no dearth of quality. And like I said, we need to give up this quantity obsession of single indicators into the multiplicity of contributions any crop, any seed gives us. We run cafes in India on the basis of the seeds we have saved. We have brought back foods that had disappeared. We call them forgotten foods. And they're some of the tastiest foods that you can eat. Unfortunately, because most of the foods that were phased out are dark, there was a rule of the white in many ways than one. The refined flour, the polished rice, the sugar, and we are bringing back the browns and the blacks, and I think diversity matters. In this country, you voted diversity to power. So thank you so much, and like I said, it's around food and seed. We are either going to leave our freedom or reclaim it. And it is the biggest democracy issue around food. It's the area where people doing the right thing in all the levels of smallness can make very big changes, especially if we join hands worldwide. Thank you.
You've been listening to physicist, ecologist, and author Vandana Shiva speaking at the Organicology Conference in Portland, Oregon on February 28, 2009. To find out more about Vandana Shiva and her work, please visit the Navdanya website at www.navdanya.org. To find out more about the Organicology Conference, please visit the Oregon Tilth website at www.tilth.org. This program was produced by pdxjustice Media Productions. To find out more about our work and to access our growing library of on-demand streaming video and audio programs, please visit our website at www.pdxjustice.org. You'll find lectures and interviews featuring speakers such as Robert McChesney, Prothap Chatterjee, Barbara Ehrenreich, Natalie Angier, Rashid Khalidi, and many others. Thanks for tuning in, and thanks for supporting listener-sponsored radio, public access cable television, net neutrality, independent bookstores, and all forms of grassroots, democratic, community media.
Thank you, Chris. It's a joy to be here with all of you. To all the organizations that have put this event together and made it possible for me to be here, I'd like to say thank you. And to the wonderful world of the seed, I'd like to say thank you. Because, you know, I started out life thinking the quanta was going to be my companion for life. And I had to abandon that passionate love affair with physics and quantum physics in particular for a love affair with the seed. Partly because the threat to the seed made me realize how vital it was to continuity of life. The word for seed, we had worked out a patent law over 20 years of democratic debate in society to get rid of the British laws that had been exactly like what we are coming back to. Total monopoly in the handful, you know, in a few companies' hands. So the lawyers, of course, were very clever, put TR before IP and said, now it's trade related by definition, so now you will accept it. After the WTO came into force, a representative of Monsanto actually said this. He said, what we've achieved in this agreement is something unprecedented. We defined a problem. And in this case, the problem was farmers saving seeds. That was a problem. And we defined the solution, make it illegal for farmers to save seeds. And we created the instrument, which is the TRIPS agreement, which forces every country now to have laws of monopoly. And we created the institution that would ensure that these are implemented. The institution, WTO, is an interesting institution because it's the international court. It's an international non-parliament, non-democratic, and it is the international executive. Yeah? As Monsanto's representative said, in shaping this treaty, we were the patient, the diagnostician, and the physician all in one. For me, that's a description of dictatorship. If you define the problem, you find the solution, you become the judge and the executive, where is democracy? And around seed, which is the most democratic experience on the planet, that's Hindi and Sanskrit, is bija. Ja means life, and bija means that in which life resides to arise on its own again and again and again. And when we start a season, lots of seed festivals with every cultivation season, and we do, because of our tropical climate, have many more cultivation seasons. Some places we have 4 seasons of cultivation, especially in the area, for example, of Bengal and Orissa. In some places we have 3, but most places we have 2. And before you sow the seed, there's a prayer. Let the seed be exhaustless. Let life never run out. And there's stories from around the world, stories from my region. I come from the Himalayan belt, where during a war and a famine, people died of starvation. But the seed which used to be kept in empty squash containers, which we call the tomri, not one seed had been eaten. Because every culture recognized you cannot eat seed corn. You've got to save it for the future. Your life doesn't matter, but life in general does matter. And it's that wisdom of the seed to renew, to multiply, to be shared, to be spread, that has suddenly been seen as a problem for those who would make money out of killing the seed, killing the essential nature of the seed as a reproductive, renewable resource. And every attempt has been made in the last 2 decades to turn seed into a non-renewable resource. Out of which, something that in its own nature creates abundance. You know, every tiny seed, I get fascinated with seeds of amaranth, for example. You know how tiny that little seed of amaranth is? And at least in our Himalaya, you can't even begin to count the number of seeds one seed of amaranth can give rise to. Or the millets, or even the rices and the wheats and the barleys. One gives rise to many. That's a problem. One should give rise to nothing. Then you make the profits. And during the 80s, I was very involved in some of these discussions. There used to be in the FAO at that time, the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations, a term used called seed wars. The chemical industry that had moved into the seed sector had started to say it's not fair that farmers save seed. It's not equitable that they save seed. Equity is monopoly. Only the corporations should have the right to seed. And they spent a lot of time, couldn't get their way, because in the United Nations, you have one vote for one country. And the majority of the countries happen to be third world countries. They happen to be countries which have given seed and biodiversity to the world, and they did not like the idea of seed being reduced to private property. So the corporations then moved to a new institution that was being created through what was then a half institution called the General Agreement on Trade and Tariffs. And it's fascinating that for 30 years, the industry had drafted laws for all kinds of monopoly. Monopoly in entertainment. If a Mickey Mouse turns up anywhere, even in a child's notebook, they should pay royalty, or a t-shirt. And then, by then, a company that had only been related to warfare, to Agent Orange, very rapidly moved into the biotechnology sector, very rapidly started to buy up both venture capital firms as well as seed companies. And Monsanto emerged as the biggest seed monopoly in the world in the drafting of what is today called the Trade-Related Intellectual Property Rights Agreement. What a mouthful. Precisely because this is not trade-related and seed is not intellectual property. It doesn't pop out of anyone's head. Intellectual property is defined as property in products of the mind. Here is a very material, biological system that is suddenly redefined as intellectual property. And a whole agreement was shaped around it, and TR was put because India, my country, refused to accept patent law as a trade issue. They said, no, this is about nations deciding how far monopolies will go, nations deciding the balance between the public and the private.